Hello and welcome to part 8 of my Books for Art Inspiration series. My name is Lee Foster Wilson and I am an artist and illustrator from Cornwall in the UK. In this series I've been talking about 3 books at a time that I have selected from my own collection of art books which I've amassed over the last 20 or so years with my husband. They are all books that I have found inspiring for my own art. And I hope that in sharing them here that you will also find them as inspiring as I do. So this time around we have this lovely big book about patterns. This one that I've had since I was a student. And this little book all about birds. Let's have a look. So first up, we have this beautiful big book, which is an ode to patterns, and it's beautifully produced. I'm not going to attempt and pronounce the author's name, but it is all about the Design Library in New York. So the book itself is hardcover, and I love how it's been stitched together on the spine. And it's got this gorgeous embossing on the letters. And I like on the side how the pages are kind of stepped. I'm sure there's a technical name for that in the bookbinding world that I'm unaware of. But the steps correlate to each section of the book inside. So opening up, you can see that immediately this is a book dedicated to patterns. There's pretty much one on every page at least. And then we get to the introduction, which is all about the Design Library, which was founded in 1972 in New York's Hudson Valley. And it says here in the introduction that it holds patterns from all over the world, both vintage and contemporary. That's the building, it's an old factory. And the patterns are there to be used as a resource for designers. And I bet it's such a beautiful space to visit. All those swatches on the shelves, it just looks like a treasure trove. Beautiful space, massive windows and all that light. And all these books too, vintage books full of patterns. And I love the way that these intro pages have been put together. It's such an enticing look into the library. Gosh, you could spend hours in there, couldn't you? And I really like these pages. They kind of show how designers would put together inspiration for collections here, placing different patterns next to each other and picking out elements and colours that will work well together for their own design work. So then we move on to section 2, which is where the patterns are. It's the biggest section of this book in these stepped sections, and it's just so rich. And each style of pattern is categorised by these names that the Design Library have given them to categorise all the patterns in their archive. And it does say that it's not inclusive of all of their patterns by any means, but each pattern in here was chosen specifically because it's a great example of that category. And there's just so many here, literally something for everybody. And I like how each category also has a little short description to describe what's going on and the criteria that they categorise stuff by. It just gives it all a bit of context, I think. So as far as inspiring my own work, though I'm not a pattern designer, I have made patterns in the past for illustration, and they are really fun to put together. But I do find looking at patterns very inspiring. I absolutely love anything decorative anyway, and I also really love colour and experimenting with how it's used and what ratios work well together. And looking at patterns can just be a really good way of studying colour, because quite often they're made with limited colour palettes due to the production process of printing on fabrics and paper. And I also really like looking at them for decorative motif ideas, texture, composition. The list goes on really, and this book is endless inspiration for that. It's such a visual feast. I really like these butterflies here and all these bugs. There's so many different categories in here as well. Just gives you an idea for various things you can use in your own work too. Yummy. I like this section about food. Zigzag. X-rated. We'll skip past that one, eh? It's beautiful. Just so many ideas. Just, yeah, a wealth of inspiration in here. So after all of that huge section there, which is impossible to show you all of it. Look at it. It's so big. There's this end section called the Creatives, which is actually printed on a different type of paper. Which gives it the book just such a nice feel as well. And it's all about the designers that have used the design library. And this section sheds some light on their creative process and their experience with the library. So it goes through a few different designers, and it talks about how some designers use the patterns as inspirational jumping off points, and others like to rework an ancient pattern for a modern audience. And I think this first one by Beacon Hill is a really good example of that. They have the brief, which is these jellyfish forms over here. And then this is the pattern that the design library sourced for them, which is a hand-painted paper from the early 20th century. And then it shows how they went through the first concept and colour development to reimagine it for their audience. And this is the final result. Then it goes through Bowden and Calvin Klein, who I think made this pattern, which they then had kind of pressed onto velvet for this coat that was worn by Michelle Obama. We have Clinique and Colfax and Fowler. I like their design brief. It's very tactile. Lots of scraps of fabric and yarn and pictures. And then we have Lululemon and Nike and Oscar de la Renta, who took their inspiration and embroidered it, I think, by the looks of it. Pottery Barn. So you can see so many big companies use the library to get inspiration. Target. Yeah, and then it ends with more patterns, of course. I mean, it must have been quite a feat to put this together, picking out from so many different designs. But it is a really beautiful book and a really interesting resource to have on my shelf. And next, get rid of patterns, we have this, which is a book all about the early work of an artist called Julie Verhoeven. I had this book when I was a student, and for a long time I thought I'd lost it, and in one of our moves around from different houses, and I was very delighted when a few years ago it turned up in a box. So if you don't know her work, Julie Verhoeven trained in fashion and has worked with Galliano and Martin Sitbon and Louis Vuitton, among others, doing like collection design and fashion illustration. And she also exhibits widely as an artist. And her work is kind of gloriously weird. And while I find some of her newer artworks kind of a bit, not abrasive, but just a bit more difficult, it was her earlier drawings and illustration that first caught my eye. And that is mostly what's celebrated in this 20-year-old book. So I've had to clip together this first section of the book so as not to show anything risque to unsuspecting viewers, as some of her drawings are quite sexualised. They're beautifully drawing, but very much not safe for work. So I'm actually going to go straight to section 5, which is here. It's her editorial section. I think it just gives a better feel of her work, so you can get to know it. And it shows, this section shows off some of the work I actually remember seeing in magazines around that time, such as Dazed and Confused and The Face. And that's where I first heard about her work. And it was actually this one here that I saw first, though I do remember seeing most of these in print at some point. I'll just show you that one a bit more closely. I was just really drawn to her unusual style, which is quite retro, obviously, and they've used the retro style quite well with this very 60s fashion feature. But I was just really drawn to the juxtaposition of seemingly kind of random objects alongside these beautifully drawn figures. And there's such a fluidity to her line that I really adore. And I actually had this magazine with the mannequin heads in it. And I remember thinking it was so cool, a fun thing to draw on. And these editorial images here, which are quite collagey, seemed really fun and interesting at the time too. Some of her line drawings. They're very dense and detailed. So many different things in them as well. And then I don't know if you can see these here. I'll hold it up again. But it was a magazine feature where jewellery was placed around her drawings. And it's like the objects inspire the art and then the art uplifts the objects. Lots of little jewelled butterflies and dragonflies and bugs. It's very beautiful. So going back through the book and ignoring that first section, she also had her own fashion line called Gibo. The imagery is quite small in here, but I quite liked how she used to use colour and placement of images on the clothes. These are some of her concepts. And then these were t-shirt prints and other prints used on the clothing. And here are some concepts for the actual shop. Again, just what I love is just how fearless it is. A kind of willingness to just have a go and see what works. Especially with kind of more site-specific things, like these drawings on this kind of really distressed wall. This is very tiny pictures of her big canvases here, but we'll move on. So this is a site-specific installation where apparently her and the person she collaborated with, someone called Juan Bolivar, they just kind of worked together in this space to make it into this kind of eerie place to be, but they worked without any sort of preconceived ideas. I just think that's such a freeing way of working. And she also did music videos, so these are some of the stills from the videos that she's worked on. That's one for Fisher Spooner. It's all very sort of fashion and electro pop related. And apparently quite often she used to find her old drawings and then draw on top of them, or cut them up and make collages like this one here, which I think is really interesting. And then you can see in this window here, she's just so prolific. There doesn't seem to be any sort of preciousness about it, which I think has a real freedom feeling to it, I think. So then here's some more of her music work for Primal Scream, and I've also had to clip these two pages together. Some of the imagery is a little bit edgy, but here are some stills from a video she did for the Sugar Babes. And she also did this artwork for a band called Gloss, who I've never heard, but I just really like how this collaging together of seemingly random objects just has a really enticing, makes you want to look closer kind of vibe to it. Really draws you in, and there's so much to look at. And then some more video work for Mel G of Spice Girls fame. And then past the editorials, we have her work for Louis Vuitton, which is such a traditional brand, but I like how she's taken all of their monogrammed leathers and fabrics and then collaged them together. Apparently she photocopied them so she could make paper collages, so that then they can just take those and apply them directly to their bags, which I thought was a really fun way of working on a project with a brand that seems a million miles from her aesthetic, with their really rigid sort of monographed style, but that she can make work that still has her voice and signature fluid and retro styling on it. They've got a real fairy tale feel to them, which is lovely. So that's it. There she is. It's quite a short book because she was still pretty young when it came out. I think she was in her early 30s. So yeah, it's kind of just a real snapshot in time. And I just find her creative freedom and her willingness to draw pretty much anything just really inspiring. So lastly, we have this little book called Birds by Geoffrey Fisher. It's much smaller than the other two. Let's see if we can zoom in. There we go. And if I take the dust jacket off this one, it's also got a beautiful hardcover underneath with the, I shouldn't have put it down, should I? With the wings of the bird corresponding to the pages of the front and back cover of the book. I think it's really beautiful. So pop that back on, because otherwise I will forget. There you go. So I've had this book for a long time. It was published in 2009 and I'm pretty sure I got it around then. So Geoffrey Fisher is an Australian artist who lives in France, and this is a really sweet little book. It's just all about a love for birds. And you may or may not know that I started a couple of years ago working on a bird series of my own, like British garden birds, mostly on ones that I've seen in my own garden. But I'm hoping to expand on that soon. And this book was definitely an inspiration for that series. My own drawings are all quite rigid in the format that I made them, but what I like about Fisher's is that he plays around with the style in which he paints them. This one's beautiful, this bowerbird. Absolutely love it. And sometimes it's all about the bird, and sometimes there is some pattern involved, or even landscapes, and there's also this little description that goes alongside, just to add in some context for each bird and why it's there and about it. They all have their own little personalities, I think. So it's just a really playful book, and it kind of reminds me that not everything has to be so rigid all the time in terms of layout and lettering, because it all has his style and it all works together. Even though he's played around with how he's drawn each bird, the consistency in this case is the colours and the textures. Like some of the drawings are super detailed, like this one here, and then others, like this one, and there's a little wren at the front, here she is, are just so simple but so beautiful with it. Just a really simple use of brushwork to make the feathers. It's really gorgeous. So there's that one, and then over the page is this quite unusual painting of a camouflaged long-eared owl. It's really, really beautiful. And then just a bit on, there's this hoopoe and this really patterned, there it is, patterned swallow. So they kind of feel really different, but at the same time, they're definitely his work. It's just a really lovely book celebrating the beauty of birds and the patterns of nature. And I like that it's a reminder to experiment within your art and not to get bogged down thinking things have to be done the same way all the time. It's really lovely. I like this kiwi. So fuzzy. And there's that beautiful bowerbird again. A lyrebird. Stunning. Same way he's done the feathers, just with a few simple brush marks there. So yeah, that's that one, and it's also got these beautiful patterns in it as well. Gorgeous. So here are the three together, patterns from the Design Library. Gas Book 13, all about Julie Verhoeven, and Birds by Geoffrey Fisher. They're all very inspiring books and artists to me, and I think they're kind of linked through their decorative applications of art. Obviously patterns, but also Julie and her highly decorative drawings applied to fashion and illustration, and then Geoffrey Fisher's birds celebrating the beauty in our world, and his playfulness also with patterns and the stylisation of foliage and landscape too. So I hope you found them inspiring as well, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more like this if you don't already. Okay, see you next time.